Hi, I'm David Wiseman, and welcome to Whispers to Live. Last week, we ended with 4 very important concepts, okay? And I'm going to go through them now just for a refresher. The first one is vulnerability, the condition of vulnerability and vigilance within the context of an intimate human relationship allow, because of memory, for the development of language. And language forms the very basis for our thoughts. In order to have self, you need to be able to remember, and you need to have language. You cannot develop language without being involved in an intimate relationship. So that's where we left off last week. Now, today I want to talk about language as the building block for the narrative we form about who we are. Not only who we are, but our purpose in the world. And I'll offer a further concept that I call the moral space. And that provides the area from which the narrative is formed. Okay? So that's kind of an overview of where we're going. All right? As human beings, we're wired both biologically and psychologically, as well as spiritually, to have a relentless desire to pursue an understanding within the world and our place in it. Let's consider again the infant, wide-eyed and utterly dependent on her caregivers, her all-powerful caregivers, ready to interact with the world. And depending on how attentive and responsive the caregiver is toward the infant, self-development could either go very well or very, very badly for this little one, and all sorts of ways in between. Now let's consider a loving and attentive caregiver, interacting with their infant in many positive ways, including holding her and touching her, smiling at her, and talking to her. An infant who is biologically wired to engage tries to mimic her caregiver and such behaviors. As a result, it's not long before the child or the infant, toddler, starts saying words like mama, mommy, or dada, daddy. A very proud moment for every parent indeed. As the interaction between the infant and the caregiver continues, and the infant becomes a toddler and will be able to mimic more and more words and behaviors of her caregivers. And the infant discovers that the mimicking produces behavior in others. The toddler will move from imitator to originator within relationships. That is, the toddler will begin to intentionally elicit responses by their caregiver and others around them. Also, this idea of originator gives the toddler a sense of power within her environment. She's learned that words and actions can give her power to what she wants. But there are boundaries, of course. There are limitations in the form of personal and social consequences. But it's very important to understand that At some critical point, and it varies a little bit with individuals, but during the toddler stage of development, the infant will learn the power of words like give, please, and no, or mine. The infant learns how to use these words in the context of a relationship. Reaching for something, grabbing it and saying mine, or holding something close when someone wants that particular item from them, and saying mine, no. That's very important because the toddler is now becoming an individual. The self is developing. This is critical. And as the child grows, the child begins to think about themselves in the world and develop a narrative. Whether they're a good boy or a bad boy, good girl or a bad girl. Very, very basic narratives about who they are. And as these narratives develop, this is very important, they develop within a moral space as the child begins to grow. Now, the older the child is, and as long as development occurs relatively normally, there will be a narrative which is built within a space and answer of 3 moral existential questions. That is, the narrative will address 3 questions about the individual. Always. An adult individual will always have those 3 questions answered within their self-narrative. And those questions are, what is the meaning of life? What is it good to be? And what is my obligation to others? Those are answered within personal narratives, either explicitly, like very obviously, or more implicitly, subtly. But in normal development, now I'm talking about normal development because there's all different ways development can go awry. But a normal adult will have a narrative which answers 3 moral questions. Now, adults can have more than one narrative, of course, but there is one that's dominant. Okay? I'm going to develop this a lot more, but it's important that you understand at this point that the narrative is developed because of language, and language is developed because of memory, and it's within the context of this intimate relationship, which is riddled with the conditions of vulnerability and vigilance. Okay? I'm going to keep returning to that because it's really important. And a lot of people who have problems in living, we go back to that vulnerability. Okay? So that's why I keep stressing this. All right? Self-narratives, they literally are the self. Okay? And because we're driven by meaning within the world, looking for meaning, creating meaning, an adult will, or even a youth, teenager, will pay attention to certain things which will follow that narrative, which will make sense in terms of that narrative. Why, you ask? Well, we tend to go with the most efficient. Okay, so the most understandable thing, we'll just take it on. Now, some people can have unhelpful self-narratives, and they keep getting stuck in finding things within the world that are unhelpful to them personally. Okay, so sometimes, so how does a person change? Well, the narrative needs to change. And remember, the narrative is based on relation with others, because that's how language was formed. And that relationship and identity goes through life. It never stops. Okay, so that's an important piece to this. So how do we develop a new storyline within our lives? Well, there's a number of conditions that must be met for that. There needs to be a legitimate option for a storyline, okay? And so when I say a legitimate option, it has to make sense to us. So that may occur within the context, for example, of a conversation you're having with someone that you admire, someone that you value, with whom you value and value their opinion. And so change can develop within the context, literally, of a conversation. And when that person offers something different about you, and that can happen in many, many different ways, you may take that on, even though it doesn't quite make sense with your self-narrative. But you trust that relationship. And so then you can begin another narrative. And it's much more complicated than that. But at this point, I'm just introducing these ideas so that you get a sense of, you get a real sense of what the self is. And then we can pack more things into that, get more sophisticated, it's more complex. But fundamentally, the self is formed within relationships. Okay? That's very, very important. And the vulnerability that we experience within that relationships causes us to be vigilant toward our caregivers, the people that are important in our lives. Because we're vigilant and paying attention, we learn. Because we have the capacity for memory. You see how that's all working? Okay. Now, I've discussed this with very, very broad strokes today. Okay, so there's lots of details in between everything that I was saying. But we'll talk about that. We'll fill in those details. We just want to get the bones right now. Okay? So I think that's where we'll leave it for today. But next week we're gonna look at the stages of development and how these different conditions are added and at what sort of stages in development of life they're expressed. Okay, and then we'll move on from there to some pretty exciting stuff. Okay, I'm David Wiseman. If you like this video, please hit the link and subscribe. And for more videos, this journey is going to be pretty exciting. All right, take care of yourselves. Until next time, I'm David Wiseman, and this is whisperstolive.com. Bye for now.